I'm going to start the recording. Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Hansberg. I'm with People for Housing Orange County, and I'm really excited today to be able to introduce this really distinguished panel to you all. I'm going to start with a bit of an introduction to sort of frame this conversation. California, including Orange County, needs more homes. We need more housing at higher densities than we have previously built in Orange County. We need more opportunities for low income and service sector workers to find affordable housing, more first-time home buyer opportunities for young families, and more downsizing opportunities for seniors looking to make a move. But where those homes go has different impacts in high opportunity communities versus communities at risk for gentrification and displacement. But the consequences of doing nothing is a decline in our collective functioning as a county. As an example, school districts with declining enrollment in high opportunity communities are opening their borders to invite children from outside the district to enroll, which creates more morning and afternoon traffic. People commute to Irvine from the Inland Empire because they cannot find housing in Orange County. In communities of concern, the consequences of not building new housing is gentrification by stasis. When there is housing turnover, the people moving in have more resources than the people that currently live there. None of this is a good outcome. We need a third way, one that creates new housing opportunities in our communities so that people can stay and thrive in the place they belong. And that's what we're going to discuss today with our panelists. Manny Escamilla is a Santa Ana native, an urban planner, librarian, and historian. He recently relocated to Oakland, but he has a history of advocacy in Santa Ana. He has degrees in urban planning, library science, and archival studies from UCLA. Rochelle Mills is the president and CEO of Innovative Housing Opportunities based in Irvine. IHO is a nonprofit housing developer that serves low and moderate income residents. She also has served on the Planning Commission in the city of Los Angeles and is trained in architecture. Kim Nguyen is the mayor pro tem of the city of Garden Grove, a city which is wrestling with its own question of where to find room for all this housing. A native of Garden Grove, she is the daughter of Mexican and Vietnamese immigrants and the first person of Asian descent to serve on the Garden Grove City Council. She's a graduate of UC Santa Cruz and works in public health. Shane Phillips works as the Housing Policy Project Manager at the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies and is the author of a brand new book, The Affordable City. He serves as a policy committee member of our sister organization, Abundant Housing LA, and has a degree in urban planning from USC. So those are the introductions, and I want to say thank you so much to you for being willing to have this conversation. It's really needed, and I'm really in awe that I was able to get such 4 fabulous people. And in one little switch, we have actually decided that Ms. Nguyen is going to serve as a panelist, and Mr. Phillips is going to be our moderator. And that was a sort of a last-minute switch, but they were gracious and made that switch. So I don't remember the order I told you to go in, so I apologize for that. Rochelle, were you first?
No, I wasn't. I believe Kim was first.
Kim was first.
Yes.
I think I was last, but that's okay. I can go first. I think Manny was first, then Rochelle, then Shane, then myself.
Okay. Manny, would you go first?
Yeah, absolutely. No problem. Yeah. Thanks for putting this all together. Thank you, everyone, for being here on a Saturday morning. I know this is kind of a hardcore housing crowd, so appreciate that. I'm not sure, like, am I supposed to go into my 7-minute spiel or my 7 minute? All right, so 7-minute spiel.
Yeah, so the format is going to be, we're going to do, everybody had their 7 minutes to speak, then we're going to do 30 minutes of questions from the moderator to the panelists, and then 30 minutes of open discussion. But obviously that's flexible if you have more or less. I really want this to be conversational, so please go ahead.
Okay, cool. So I guess just for timing, like whoever's like moderating the time, just like put the little raise hand thing on there. That way I know, like, 15 seconds to kind of wrap things up, and that'd be helpful.
I'll do that.
Cool. All right. So yeah, Manny Escamilla, a longtime resident for the city of Santa Ana, worked in the city government for 14 years. Had a lot of kind of experience learning about the history of Santa Ana. That's kind of what I started off doing, and was really kind of the history of development and how the city grew. A lot of the structural impacts that federal, state, and county policy had on our low-income community in the city of Santa Ana. And through that, got an interest in urban planning, had an opportunity to work in the planning department in Santa Ana, currently planner over in Oakland in the Bay Area. But there are at least just like 4 little things I wanted to kind of highlight as we start this discussion. Well, it definitely won't be the end all of everything, but 4 key things. Um, so the first thing is, kind of we're doing this in the context of a new arena cycle. So our housing numbers are all kind of up in the air. And I think we have varying opinions on this panel as to how robust that methodology is and kind of what tweaks need to be done for the 7th cycle. But what I can tell you is that out of the 198 city or 191 cities in the SCAG region, so this entire Southern California area governments, Santa Ana had the most appeals. The only thing was that the city of Santa Ana itself didn't actually submit any appeals. So it was the only city in the entire region that had appeals on its behalf. And in fact, there were 4 local cities that appealed the RHNA numbers, trying to get additional housing into kind of the lowest income community in Orange County, right? So like this is the context for me as far as like what I'm seeing, right? So at the regional level, we're talking about equity, and the thing that was kind of troubling to me is in a lot of these appeals, there was an appeal towards equity of distribution, even though that meant putting more housing in the poorest district, right? So like that was effectively what Newport Beach, Yorba Linda, and Irvine were arguing was that these lower income communities needed to be equitable and to take more housing in. So there's this kind of caveat that I want to put out there is that when we use the word equitable and everyone sees it as a positive thing, we have to be very specific as to how it's actually impacting these various communities. So that's like context for me right off the bat. Number 2, I think the other thing I kind of keep seeing when we're talking about development in Orange County is that there is no more vacant land. But to me, again, kind of historian, right? This land was never vacant. It was, populated by indigenous peoples, conquered by the Spanish, then conquered by the United States after kind of the Mexican Revolution. So there are a lot of periods where it wasn't necessarily the land was empty, vacant, and there's kind of this mythology that yes, the land was pristine. We came in, Europeans, and developed it, and then now it's full. But at each kind of time and place, there was a pattern of land development that reflected the economy, that reflected the demographics, the population density, the overall connection of the Southern California region into the global economy. So those are the sorts of things that now when we talk about vacant land, we say that there is no vacant land in Orange County or hardly any developable land. But if you look at the average subdivision, really like the amount of land that has any amount of buildings on it, not talking about roads, not talking about lawns, not talking about driveways, just buildings, it still ends up being less than like 30% of the overall volume of our cities, right? So I think there's still room to grow. It just happens to be a different type of development. And the era of greenfield development in Orange County is over, right? There are very few cities. I think Irvine's probably one of the only ones that still has highly developable greenfield tracks that they have like master plans for that are being implemented. The rest is really going to be infill, and it's going to be a shift in mentality as to how that infill is done. And to that shift, in order to kind of keep what people really kind of are honing in on is this belief in community character. And at the end of it, so my degree in urban planning really focused on urban design, and I think that we don't pay enough attention to it. So I do believe that there are some factors when it comes to the actual design of buildings, their scale and the size. So really talking about more granular, smaller structures. So fourplexes, eightplexes, things that are a little bit more kind of in keeping with this missing middle debate that look good, right? So I think that there's kind of an aversion to new construction because, quite frankly, a lot of new construction is hideous. And I think that for me, one of the things you can look at is McMansion hell, or like like on Twitter you just see a bunch of buildings that go up that just don't look good, and there is this kind of aesthetic revulsion to that makes it harder for new construction. And I know that sometimes these aesthetic critiques are used as kind of support for NIMBYism, but at the end of the day, you can kind of say that they're not necessarily constructed to fit into the surrounding community. So working on these design standards that they're uniform, that neighborhoods actually welcome new buildings because they look good. I think it'd be beneficial. And we do see this trend in different communities, usually kind of higher end development. So like a neo-industrial deco structures, things that look good, that are very functional, economically, or pencil out, and at the same time add value to their surrounding community. So those are things that I'd like to see. And the last thing I just want to close on, since we started sort of with the equity question, was that in my mind, there's also two kinds of equity, right? We're going to be talking about how the outcomes and kind of how different communities are equitably treated and, based on their circumstances, are participating in construction of new housing. But to me, there's also the equity question as to who owns these buildings, how money is kind of being funneled. So for me, I've always been very supportive of rent control because what I see in my community in Santa Ana is that you have a lot of outside owners that essentially live on the coast or live in New York, San Francisco, and then own these large apartment complexes that then essentially funnel rent and money out of my community and into these kind of coastal enclaves, right? So that those patterns of ownership to me are very important in understanding in order to kind of develop a way forward, because I don't necessarily want to build if all those buildings are doing are effectively kind of taking money out of this low-income community and transferring into high wealth enclaves that then refuse to build housing. So that's I think the points that I want to kind of hone in on. But I don't know where the conversation will go. So and that's pretty much all I have.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Rochelle, would you like to go?
Sure, thank you. I'm Rochelle Mills. I'm the president and CEO of Innovative Housing Opportunities. And I've been in the affordable housing field for about 15 years. Prior to that, as she mentioned, they say you've got 7 careers in everybody, and I think I had 6 other ones. My background includes architecture, community development and engagement, arts and culture, tourism, marketing, development, and media. And it's interesting, when I came into this field, I was thinking, what do I have to offer? And I actually think that my background puts me uniquely in the right place for what we are doing at this moment. If we look at housing as simply anathema or a challenge to keeping us comfortable in our single family tracts, then we miss the impact that housing has. Housing is a determinant of a social determinant of health. Without housing, you don't have stable education, employment opportunities, workforce opportunities. It is the catalyst that brings investment into communities. It's the catalyst that gets people to be able to take care of themselves in a way that helps them plan for their future, which then breaks the cycle. We cannot build our way out of housing insecurity. What we can do is create more housing so that people who can feel comfortable moving up so that the others can move in, and it should be that cycle. For us, at IHO, one of the things that we are looking at is 6 dimensions of housing that are critical to us. And I was writing these down and of course forgot the 6th one, but again, is it catalytic? Does it have the ability to promote long-term impact, a positive impact into the community that can be replicated, and that uplifts everyone? Speaking of uplifting, can we honor the arts and culture? The reason why people push back is they are afraid to lose the identity and the DNA of the community. Can we do that? Well, yes, we can if we look at the 3rd option, and that is the services and the engagement. You cannot bring the kinds of high acuity need populations into the housing that we are looking to support right now without having that partnership with services. And unfortunately, when we talk about the cost of housing, we always short shrift the services. The services are what make people stable and able to live comfortably in the housing, which downstream saves us in terms of medical costs, in terms of emergency costs and first responders and et cetera. But yet we are paying these people the least. And I have found, which is unconscionable, examples where service providers and those case managers are actually living in their cars, but providing the services. So when we talk about the entire ecosystem of housing, we need to make sure that we are the next thing, accountable. When we talk about equity, just as he said, equity in what way? We talk about at IHO, are we using the dollars to push our dollars, our ability to hire consultants, are we using those funds to mandate and encourage and in some cases require our consultants to partner with small and minority owned businesses? I would hate to go 5 years from now and find out when we say, well, can you find a Black architect, or can you find an Asian builder? I would hate to have people still tell me I can't find them. Well, then let's invest in making sure that they can compete, so that 5 years from now, it won't be something we have to look up. It is simply a matter of, here's a great name, here's a great and competent professional who also is, diverse. Another thing we look at is authenticity and accountability. We believe in accountability, not just for the developers, for the communities. When we talk about sharing this, as he said, I had a woman who was an incredible advocate for housing, an incredible advocate. And she takes me to the side and she says, but I love my neighborhood. I love my 2-story neighborhood. And isn't it better that those people live in the neighborhood like where you live, because they're around people that look like them? That is not authentic. And if we can't acknowledge that these are all our neighbors. I said at a speech the other day, people will advocate for a home for their cars before they advocate for a home for their neighbors. That's unacceptable to me. If we are going to do this, it has to be across the county. I live in LA County. I tell people I'm bilingual because I speak fluent LA County and conversational Orange County. And sometimes I think, am I not translating it? Are you not understanding? Do I need to figure out more language so that you can understand? It doesn't belong only in LA. And when we come to Orange County, it can't all be reposited in Santa Ana. We have to make this county a place that is welcoming to all people. And I will end with this. IHO was formed as a result of a lawsuit 45 years ago in Irvine. We started as Irvine Housing Opportunity, and the lawsuit was to require the city of Irvine to include housing for low to moderate income residents in its zoning. That was a statewide lawsuit by some law firms, Public Counsel and Fair Housing, that actually influenced housing elements across the state. That is the reason why low to moderate income housing, or one of the reasons why low to moderate income housing is included in housing elements across the state. It's the right thing to do, and all of us should accept that.
I agree with you, which is one of the reasons that I think the YIMBY movement has a place in Orange County, which is to push the envelope and make room in high opportunity communities that do not currently reflect the diversity of the population in California and in Orange County. So I'm so thrilled to know you, Rochelle. And I'm thrilled to know Kim Nguyen from the city of Garden Grove. I met her at the SCAG General Assembly in 2018 and was inspired by the great champion that she is for her community. And impressed with all of the wisdom that exists in this generation of young people that are taking leadership in Orange County. So Mayor Pro Tem, please go ahead.
So I'm definitely the housing novice on this panel, but I will say that I think I bring a little bit of a different perspective in the sense that, I was just a minor correction. I was elected as the first person of Latin descent, not Asian descent. So that would be Thai fan in Santa Ana.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I apologize.
It's okay. But I was also the youngest ever elected. And I think I'm still the youngest Democrat female elected in Orange County, the youngest. So that definitely needs to change, because I feel like I'm no longer in the young club. I'm going to be turning 30 this year. So I was elected I ran at 24, won at 25. And I was the only council member to be serving that was actually a renter, and in renting, not necessarily by choice, but by only option, right? And it was becoming really stressful and almost unaffordable to be a renter in my own city. And I was a freaking elected official. So that to me was like a huge red flag. I was paying over $1,800 for a 1-bedroom apartment, and we multiple new affordable housing units, new housing projects that were coming in that looked way better than the little shithole I was living in, excuse my language. So it was really frustrating for me. I'm seeing, my colleagues driving their Beamers, have houses, own duplexes, are renting them out, and I'm here 25 years old complaining about rent in our community, and no one else seemed to really care. So that was really frustrating. It took a pandemic, but now I'm a homeowner. So yay me, new stresses come with that. And it was an extremely challenging process to get through. And I feel like I found help along the way, but they don't prepare you for this. And as a young person, it's really scary. I think, especially as a child of immigrants who are very unfamiliar with the process as well. But it's an achievement that I'm really proud of, and I definitely want to have more conversations with young people who are looking into buying homes. But enough about that, and me focusing on my city. So Garden Grove, I appreciate Manny not putting me on blast, but it's okay, Manny. Garden Grove also filed an appeal against Santa Ana, and for not the same reasons that other cities did. So it made it really frustrating for me to see that, because I'm listening to their appeals. As a member of the SCAG council, I attended the appeal hearings to kind of hear what was happening and also be there for my city, and just hearing the arguments and knowing that those cities weren't coming from the right place. I think Garden Grove, I don't know how many of you know, has been allocated 19,122 units that it has to build over the next 8 years. 19,000, not 1,900, 19,000 units. I don't know how we're going to do that, but we have an amazing team that's trying to figure that out right now. We have our surveys up online. We have a virtual workshop happening on April 21st to talk about the environmental justice element in our housing element. We've had a few surveys that I'm trying to figure out if we've asked demographic information, because I think it's really important to capture who's actually participating in these surveys. In Garden Grove, we have this unique circumstance where it happens to be more conservative, affluent Caucasian individuals who are participating in our government and are dictating our actions through fear of re-election, I suppose. I'm fortunate enough to be representing the most democratic, the lowest median age, but also the lowest median income and predominantly Latino district in my city. So when I wear or throw on my radical cape and say some crazy things, it's okay, because I know my community is backing me up. And so that poses a really difficult position, because the prime example that I can give that is a struggle for us as elected officials right now is the changing laws around ADUs. Garden Grove is probably one of the only cities in Orange County that has approved as many ADUs as we have. I think we have approved over 350. And I know that there was a meeting recently where cities were, boasting about passing or allowing for 3 to 10 or 15. And I'm like, we're in the hundreds and you're only allowing this many. But the conversation around that was where I really saw the divide. We had council members who were attempting to put more restrictions on ADU and tying it to RHNA. And can we sue the state of California regarding our allocation? What actions can we take to stop from having to build? Again, all arguments coming from homeowners who are claiming that ADUs gets rid of green space. I didn't realize that someone's backyard was part of our green space in Garden Grove. And though the same elected officials preaching on that talking point, my clap back to them was that if your priority was really green space, then we'd be building more parks, not complaining about housing. And then the other one that I love is parking. We have a parking problem. No, we have a housing problem. We have people who are doubled, tripled, and quadrupled up in their homes and apartments and mobile homes. And those units had a specific number of parking, but now that so many people are overcrowding in these spaces, those parking spots were not accounted for them. So if we had enough housing for everyone would have their designated parking. Not that solves too many of the problems anyway, but just another talking point used to make excuses for not building more. And so it's a very difficult because the perception is that millennials, don't want to own single family homes with the white picket fence, have kids and dogs and get married and all of that good stuff. That the perception is that that's not of our interest. And that's false. We've made it very difficult for us to achieve that. And that's why it seems that we don't want it. But if the option was there, I'm pretty sure many millennials would want to own homes, build up that credit and equity, and be able to invest and also own other properties to rent out, just like folks above our generation. So very complicated topics, and I'm sure I'll be on the hot seat throughout this panel as the person. I think Manny said it best. I want to make a t-shirt. So much responsibility, very little authority. So treat me tenderly, Shane, when you ask me the questions. I will turn it over to Shane let him wrap it up.
Sure, I'll just jump right in, and thank you to our other panelists for sharing your introductions. I'm going to share a much quicker introduction for myself and then just jump into the first question here, which will go out to everyone. And it's going to be a very large scale question. But just to tell a little bit about myself first, my name is Shane Phillips, and I am the Housing Initiative Project Manager for the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. My job is, housing research at both the kind of grant funded, big picture, peer reviewed research level, and also just targeted reforms. How can we improve rent stabilization? How can we raise more money? What is the role of market rate housing? And lots of educational things as well, not new research necessarily, but trying to communicate a lot of these ideas to, advocates and others who are interested in this, but maybe don't spend all of their time with housing. The other, recent thing I've done is publish a book on housing, and it's called The Affordable City. And just to talk about that a little bit, because I think it'll frame my perspective in this conversation, really one of the overarching arguments of my book is a pretty obvious fact that different housing policies serve different needs. And I frame them as three kind of categories of, we have supply policies, we have stability policies, we have subsidy policies. All of these are really important, and we tend to focus as individuals on one or another. And we need to find ways to bring these all together. And just to talk about those three a little bit, on the supply side, building housing is absolutely essential to keep prices in check, to accommodate growth, and actually make our communities better over time. But it's also true that it doesn't necessarily help the person who's facing harassment by their landlord or who loses their income and can't afford rent. And the reality is that building housing takes a lot of time, and whereas people can end up in crisis really on the turn of a dime. And so supply is important, but it's not everything. At the same time, stronger tenant protections can help people stay in their homes. They do in very large numbers, especially here in California. But they can't actually make the housing market more affordable overall, because their purpose is really to prevent harm, not to make things better. And I want to be very clear that that's a very important goal in itself. It's not a bad thing that that's all they do. It's just different policies serve different goals. Subsidies, again, also help people kind of in different ways: rent assistance, legal support, building new affordable homes. But if housing keeps getting more and more expensive, then we're not going to get much out of those subsidies. And we've seen here in LA that even as we spend more on homeless housing and services, for example, because of our failures on supply policies, on stability policies, we should have more people becoming homeless than we've been able to get off the street each year, even as we've helped more people off the street each year because of our additional spending. So to bring this all together and turn this into a question, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about really, I was excited that Elizabeth reached out to me because I've been thinking about this third way. How do we tie all of these things together and not just get stuck on our silos? And my view is we just, first and foremost, need to be permitting far, far, far more housing in wealthier and job-rich communities, even as we at the same time strengthen protections, tenant protections and anti-displacement protections across the entire city, across the entire region. And that balance, I think, is where we need to go. And I say that for both policy and political reasons. On the policy side, I think, if we, as I said, just supply policies, just tenant protections and stability policies alone won't help everyone. We have to do all of this kind of together. And on the political side, making change is hard, and YIMBYs alone aren't going to successfully make the kinds of changes we need, nor our tenant unions, nor our community-based organizations. We really all have to be in this together as much as we can. And so pursuing all of these different threads at the same time, I think, is one way to do that in coalition. And so to turn this to the panelists, so what I'm talking about, building a lot more housing in wealthy communities, even as we strengthen tenant protections. I just want to hear from everyone. Does that sound like what you want to see? Is that something you find yourself aligned with, or do you have a different perspective on this? And we can kind of go from there. It could be long answer, short answer, but we'll just start the conversation with that kind of big picture question. And I'll go to Manny since you went first.
All right. Well, thank you. Someone else can go first. It's all good with me. But no, I think very much in line. I will have to say that your book, someone's like pitching it in the comment section. I do recommend it. I've been pitching it to local policymakers myself. I thought it was very informative and, tries to strike that balance between, hey, let's stop shooting each other with arrows and like, let's try to figure out how we can work together on issues. And that's tough. So this is all kind of part of that coalition building. So I think that, having an elected official on this panel is very helpful because a lot of this does boil down to kind of political will, the ability to kind of get people together and to have elected officials that actually acknowledge that there's a problem, right? So I can tell you that working in an administration, as a bureaucrat, you can kind of see like some of the policy priorities. And I was still astonished that housing wasn't actually considered that much of a critical issue, right? So we could say like, oh yeah, like, I would write a report, say, yeah, the housing crisis, and then it would be struck out and it would be like, oh no, you can't say that. And I'm like, what world are you living in? So there are, things like that where just the basic acknowledgement helps kind of, lead us in a general direction. I think I'm very hopeful that this is kind of the direction that we lead into. So I am very much a fan of a grand bargain where we're trying to figure out all these various issues. We put them into a big document and then we implement, right? So having like that legal mechanism by which we strike a deal and then we basically implement the deal is my preferred method, and that is a method that requires a lot of community input. Some things that are given, some things that are taken. So for me, I'm very much about having an inclusionary housing fee. I want it up here. Everyone else wants it at zero on the development side, so we kind of reach a bargain there. Maybe add density bonuses, but figure out the right places where that's allowed. So there are lots of little mechanisms that we can kind of try to strike a deal with. And I think that, in order to get there, though, we do need that conversation and that kind of being the end goal. And, I'm not so much like, oh, we're going to be good once we have 10,000 units, so much as I don't want a family to worry about being kicked out of their home because they can't afford rent. I do not want to see the look in the child's face when the parents tell them that we can't live here anymore. Like that is happening day after day after day and is scarring an entire generation of people that are tenuously being part of our community, and that should not be allowed. That should be one of the number one priorities that we have as a community, is making sure that people aren't worried about being, on the streets the next day. So if we kind of frame that as a moral issue, I think it does have much more power rather than talking kind of in these other metrics that are very useful for analytical work. But again, kind of reaching beyond the circle of, the 45 people that will show up on a Saturday morning for a housing panel. That is, I think, the argument that we need to start making, is this is about basic humanity. This is about, reducing the amount of stressors in one's life. And really, it's about the preservation of the American dream. And, the American dream doesn't necessarily have to be a single family home. Like I entered the housing market through a condo. I think that condos are actually a pretty good option for, kind of first time home buyers. And I lucked out, right? I was very fortunate, but, not everyone should have to go and do like 2 master's degrees, go to like an elite university, get a really solid job. And like, it shouldn't be that hard, right? You shouldn't have to do everything perfect in order to have a decent chance at a stable living situation. So that's the big correction. And I think that, again, framing it in those larger moral terms is probably what gets us to that end goal. So not the, units are good, but that end result is better.
Right. Yeah, I do want to echo that, your point about, this is really about people. It's not just about numbers. And, we do get very focused in on, what is our target? And I mean, I would say one of the more frustrating things I would see from the cities from the past cycle with RHNA, who had very low targets, you know, Beverly Hills could say we had 3 units and we built our units, we met our goals, with no awareness of like, well, how are the people living in your city experiencing that? You've met your goal, but what is, you know, are people able to stay in their homes? Is it affordable to them? That's what we really need to be concerned with. So I see, Kim, you've unmuted, so you want to go next?
I want to go before I forget, because Manny
Okay.
just like had me going to 12 different places with that. So, you know, for me, I grew up living in an apartment up until I was probably 10 in a different county. In Santa Barbara County, I lived in Goleta, and I was shoved in a little area where it was gang ridden. It was community. It was a community of color, so very different. And then when I came to Orange County, specifically Garden Grove, it was definitely culture shock for me to see the stark comparisons. And I say this because, you know, I grew up on Medi-Cal, food stamps, definitely different than a lot of the folks that I'm encountering here as an elected official, predominantly my residents who I'm engaging, right? And I think it's one of the things that I'd say that's kind of a solution, but not, is having more folks like myself, like Manny, other folks who have this expertise, because I definitely don't, but have that lived experience to run for office, right? Because politics has always been a game for affluent white men. And they can't, or I don't believe that they have the capability of empathizing with the struggle that the groups that we're advocating for go through. And so until there's folks like myself at the table and helping make those decisions and pointing out like, hey, you're forgetting this, or think about it this way, we're never going to get to that point. And the other part of it is, how often does RHNA cycles come, and how often do we update our element? By that time, how many people have gone in and out of council? And so there's many folks that haven't gone through this part, who are unfamiliar, and where, to Manny's point, where housing isn't the prime concern, so we're not really talking or addressing that. We're too busy. The state doesn't give us money to fix our streets, to fix our storage, our storm drains, our sewers, traffic lights, police officers, which is a whole other topic we're not going to get into, firefighters, you know, all that other stuff, building permits, the counters, the staff that are working that. And so there's so many other things that are happening. Do we want to build hotels? Where do we want to put our resources towards to gain revenue for the city, to then provide resources or services to our constituents? But the thing that we're forgetting is the connection between the services that we provide and who's receiving it. You know, how many times do I advocate that we, you know, send letters in support of particular bills that may or may not have anything to do with the city as far as the jurisdiction and control that we have? But my point is, if our residents are not healthy, don't have access to quality healthcare, they can't go to work. If they're not going to work, they're going to end up homeless. They're not going to be in our schools. They're not going to be spending their money in our city. And that's how I kind of frame it back to get them interested. Okay, people are going to be leaving our city. They're not going to be spending their dollars in our grocery stores, at our restaurants. That then diminishes our revenue source that pays for the jobs that provide these services, right? Because cities don't provide you a product to buy. We pay for the labor that does the thing that you need, right? And so it gets kind of complex there. And then when you think about when we finally do come to the point where we have the RHNA cycle happening, we're updating our element, and you get slapped with 19,122 units, and then all of the YIMBYs are coming out like, we're not going to build this here, do it somewhere else. Same arguments that we hear for the homeless. So then the conversation shifts from, we don't want to do it, rather than why is it that we got this number and why do we need to do it? You know, I will say that I'm not happy with that number, because I think I shared this with all of you when we were prepping for this, is that we were 3,000 people short of being exempt, similar to the city of Anaheim and Santa Ana. And so we really got gypped, in my opinion, because the same criteria that's used to determine where more housing should go, your proximity to transportation, job access to jobs, were all how we got marked up high and got one of the highest numbers. I think the only city that got more than us was LA. And so that complication for me was because while I'm an advocate for housing, I also don't want to burden my already impoverished and disadvantaged community. So I think that's where like rubber meets the road, and you're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Right, you're representing one of those. I mean, there's the question of, okay, we want to focus housing in richer, whiter areas, which have traditionally been those that have excluded housing and people. But and that's true between cities and within cities. And you yourself are representing a city that I think overall is poorer than most in Orange County. And you're actually in a district within that city that is especially low income. And so, maybe we'll come back to it, but we will come back to it, in fact. But I'm going to be curious to hear a little bit more about those politics within your city and how, it's being thought about how you're going to distribute that. But I'll pass it to Rochelle, just to reiterate the original question, just kind of your thoughts on this framework, this grand bargain, as Manny called it, of like, let's really get a lot of housing into wealthier communities that have traditionally excluded it, at the same time as we try to strengthen protections and hopefully spend more on subsidized housing and rent assistance and those kinds of things as well.
Well, I think we just have to do more everywhere is the solution. More at all levels of income, more in all communities, more. The phrase that entered my head this week was do better, be better. If we can do better, then let's do better. If we can be better personally, then let's all make that commitment. Yes, we can do it. What surprises me, we were in the Anaheim Housing Element group, and looking at how affordable housing has been built over the last few years since the last element, and where it had been concentrated. And there was one wealthy area where there was one project that was denied, and it was because of incompatibility. The thing with wealth is that they can organize at levels that the rest of us can't. And they can prevent things from coming into the neighborhood because it is incompatible. And that should be an argument that is no longer valid to use. I think it is just in our faces that we need the housing. Kim mentioned 19,000 in her city. Every city has tens of thousands of units that are required, and we can no longer use the argument that it's just too difficult. It is what it is, and we cannot, by wealth, argue the point that we'd love to have it here, but it's just incompatible. You know what? Suck it up. These are your neighbors, your parents, your colleagues, somebody else's neighbors, parents, colleagues. We all need to make room. There's something that I wanted to address, and that is actually the actual production. We were speaking to some of the council members, and we're starting to hear more and more that as much as cities would love to build affordable housing, COVID really did a number, and the tax base is gone. The tax base is how the dollars come in to pay for the affordable housing. And what a lot of the public agencies and electeds are saying to us is, realistically, we can put in the affordable housing, but we get no taxes from that. So now we are competing against the income that cities need to make. And I need to say that because I want to recognize that there really is a challenge here. Aside from the spiraling cost, somebody put, have you bought a 2x4 lately? Yes. And if I could figure out how to build housing from pasta, I would certainly give it a shot. There are just real challenges that we have. The need to bring in taxes, the cost of putting it together, now we have where housing and labor used to be partners, we now have an adversarial role that really is serious and threatening. But one of the things that challenges us as affordable housing developers is the time frame. How do we accelerate this? We had a project in Southern California where the city bought the land. Here we are 8 years later. The cost to build that project is exponentially different. And building housing, taking 4 to 7 years to build units is unacceptable. It's untenable. The cost keeps going up. The requirements, affordable housing is the hope chest for all things, mental health, for environmental sustainability, for accessibility, for community engagement. All of these things take time and add cost. Now, please understand me. I am not saying these things aren't valid, but these things all take time, add cost. Our question is, with the urgency that we're dealing with, how do we break that up? How do we take the entitlement process from a 2-year process to 6 to 9 months? Do we really need to send something to one department, get it back, send it to the next department? They make a comment, then we get it back, have to take it back to, I mean, those are inefficiencies that are costing us and costing the humanity of building housing. How do we stop the unintended consequences of the legislation that we're putting together? Right now, everybody sees the crisis of housing, the homelessness, the trash. And so all of the housing policy is around housing extremely low income or formerly homeless, which is critically important. However, in communities where you have most of the transit, where we are doing all the upzoning, we are putting all of the need. All of the need is going into a handful of communities, a handful of neighborhoods. And what I'm worried about is the fatigue of the communities that were on our side, who are going to eventually push back and say, why in my neighborhood and not in Laguna Beach? Those are the people who have every right to say, you know, we're getting all of the people with the highest need, and we are driving out economic investment. Again, when we talk about affordable housing, our motto at IHO is it starts with housing, but from that you need jobs, you need the amenities in those communities. And if we are not encouraging, if we're not doing a mix of incomes where we have spent the last 20 years convincing all of us that our kids need to go to college. They go to college and now they can't afford to come back home. The housing that we're building is all for low income. They can't afford to buy a home. Those elders who want to downsize, now their accumulated wealth is too high. So they are having to move out of the neighborhood. So their support systems are going. So how do we do more holistic housing policy that looks at the big picture and not just what is the reigning community eyesore at this moment? When I came into affordable housing, it was seniors. Then it went from seniors to veterans, and we had to turn our senior projects into veteran senior projects. Then it was homelessness. We had to turn those veteran projects into homeless veteran projects. And now it is, and so we keep having to chase those dollars, and we're not moving the needle, because each time we do that, we're adding another year or two to the process. You know, there are a lot of structural infrastructure issues that we need to look at when we try to solve this. And I certainly encourage all of you who are listening in, who have influence, who can speak to your neighbors, when we try to solve for this, let's look at the big picture and the long-term consequences of the work that we're doing.
And you got at something that I actually wanted to make my next question, and I'll ask it a little more pointedly to you and more generally to Manny and Kim. You talked about more of everything, more everywhere. And I think a pushback you would get from certain communities is, and I think that's sort of been the message of YIMBYs as well, and the pushback they get is, well, sure, technically maybe you can build everywhere, but in practice, it ends up going to specific communities. And so it can't just be, let's open things up everywhere, because everywhere is not actually going to respond to that in the same way. And so how do you think about that aspect of this, the actual power on the ground of different communities, and how equal rules don't result in equal outcomes?
Well, you know what? Why do people have the right to say no? I truly, maybe this is, Pollyanna-ish of me, but how do you get to say no? I'm looking at the fact that we're, that we have managed to have some housing policy that allows us to build housing in industrial areas. How can we make that change, and we can tell someone who's living in a single family community but not there, How was it that we were able to mitigate all of the ecological issues in brownfield communities and brownfield land? And we can solve that, but someone's got a patio, a swimming pool in the backyard, and they can say no. I mean, at some point, this is the thing, the challenge that I have with the housing element. What good is a housing element if there are no teeth? If you can eventually say, yeah, I looked around but can't do it, I think it needs to be at a certain point, you don't get to say no. What you do get is to have an opportunity to find an alternate solution. When I first started doing community engagement, I remember going into a community in LA, and I said, okay, here's the thing. You got to come up with a solution. It can't be no. It has to have, you have to consider, if there were no resources, how would you do it? It was to a group of teenagers, and it has to be replicable. And I was surprised that at the end of the hour, they had a list of options. I think we give too many back doors, we give too many back doors. Well, it may be cut the view to the beach. It could be that we don't have green space. Then design it to have green space. I mean, if we understand that green space is important, culture is important, economics, investment is important, then figure out how to do it so that those things are honored. But you don't get to say no. What you say is not this year, but next year we'll be ready. There has to be teeth, and there has to be a requirement. I also wish that there was an incentive for innovation and pilot projects. LA County had a project a few years ago, a housing innovation project, and it was a $250,000 challenge. What could you do for $250,000 in single family neighborhoods? And they were just amazing. I mean, you had some people who had capsule housing, you had container housing, of course, different kinds of structures. If people can make the case for something that is replicable and is sound and meets those minimum standards that we all want, then there should be an opportunity to have that, instead of saying no, wait till in the next 8 years for the next housing element, or the next election cycle for the new mayor to come in, or what have you. Why don't we say, we'll keep doing what we're doing because that's all we've got right now, but we will put some money aside to be able to consider something that is innovative, outside of the box, something that can accelerate.
And I'm going to jump ahead here because the time is flying by, and I want to ask a more political question here for Councilmember Nguyen. And that is, so I asked you in our pre-call if you could read the executive summary of a report by some of my colleagues, Chris Elmendorf, Pablo Monkinen, Moira O'Neill, and Eric Biber. And it's something called "I Would If Only I Could," and it's basically looking at this the changes to state housing element law, where, as Rochelle has said, they haven't had teeth traditionally. Many cities have effectively just ignored them, and these are the goals that the state has mandated that these cities strive for in terms of housing production. And if they didn't do it, there was really no consequence. And so, if you had some residents who opposed new housing and they told you as a council member, hey, like, why make a plan that complies with this? There's no consequences anyway, just ignore it, or just do something that doesn't meet the requirements and it'll be fine. And that used to be basically true. Now, because of changes in state housing element law, there's this pro-housing default, where if you're not in compliance, then developers to some extent can come in and kind of build whatever they want, wherever they want. And even if you are in compliance, if you're not meeting your housing targets, if developers include some affordable units on site, they get a streamlined approval process that the city can't really say no to. So I'm curious, I know we're very early in the housing element process still, or we're still in the process of updating them, but have you seen that affecting your local politics or conversations about this, or is it still kind of something that people aren't really aware of?
I think a little bit of both. So I think the people that I want to be paying attention and following are not. And then the ones that I wish would just go away are definitely all about it. And they're talking specifically to the council members I wish were not council members. So it's making my life really difficult. I will say that I went above and beyond the homework assignment, and I read the whole thing, and I
Wow.
took a ton of notes, because I was like, oh, I'm reading and I'm like, man, it's as if I wrote this, except if I was more well-versed in housing and way more eloquent. So I was like, I'm gonna take down these notes because they made valid points, right? And it seems so like duh. So something that Rochelle said earlier too that I want to tie into this question is, so Garden Grove is now by districts, right? We're elected by our district rather than citywide. And so that has been a tremendous blessing, but also a curse, because you have projects that are happening in specific districts. Anything, I think personally, anything east of Euclid and Garden Grove is going to get a no if it's like housing or affordable or anything that we would think is a good thing. And that's because the neighbors that live next to these projects that are coming in are the ones that show up to the meeting to have these conversations and tell us that they don't want it. And so something that was mentioned in the report you had me read is that we're constantly thinking in relation to that neighborhood rather than citywide or rather than regionally. And sitting as a SCAG council representative, I think about this all the time. Like, why are we thinking so small? We need to think big picture. And it gets really frustrating. And I keep coming back to the ADU argument because it really is such a microcosm to this larger issue, because the arguments being made for this apply to the arguments being made regarding RHNA and the housing element. And quite frankly, it's being recorded and will be shared, but I'm going to pretend like I didn't say it. I kind of hope that we don't finish our housing element and we have to be forced to allow, if it's 20% of affordable housing, that it just gets passed through, because this may have detrimental unintended consequences for my district, but I'm just like, God damn, we can't do it any other way. So it's kind of like for ADU, we had 5 public hearings, 3 at the city council level, 2 at the planning commission. It pushed us approving state law from, I believe, August or September of 2020 all the way until like a month ago. And in that time, we were having to approve ADUs based on the most relaxed and least restrictive form of the state law. So I was like, by all means, let's delay this much further if we need to. I'm okay with that. And so it's difficult because you have council members who are so focused on, I need to appease my YIMBY constituent.
NIMBY, right?
YIMBY.
NIMBY.
Sorry, NIMBY.
Okay.
You're right.
If only they felt that way.
That's right. I'm seeing Elizabeth think, and I'm thinking NIMBY. And so to Rochelle's question, how can it happen? It's because you can vote for me or you can't vote for me. That's how it happens. That's how you can say no. Because the folks that are coming, right? The folks that would be more advocating for the things that we're talking about, young folks, renters, poor, communities of color, are the folks that are least likely to organize, are the folks least likely to be participating in local government, and are least likely to be taken seriously. When I came into the picture when I was 24 years old, it was through the guise of trying to get us to district elections. And every community meeting that I attended was in full capacity with white, affluent, home owning, older white people. And they, just got away with saying extremely racist things to me. The treatment that I received, it's one that I just had not experienced before. It was really mind blowing to me. And here, all I was doing was advocating for representation and equity in my city. As if I was asking, I'm not even going to oppose what I could compare that to, but something really, really awful. It's like if I was asking something really bad, and I'm just like, how? And that's how, because these are the folks that come to our meetings. They're the ones that lobby the council members. They're the ones that show up to public hearings and make public comments. And then they're the ones that, run hit pieces on us, talk to the POAs, talk to whatever other organizations, and get the money to not get us elected. So it really comes down to when you're making that decision of who to vote for, like, are you voting for them because they were your neighbor, because they were on a commission, or because you listen to what their platform is and what they're advocating for, and they're going to be advocating for things such as affordable housing, attainable housing, market rate, whatever, parks, whatever it is that you're interested in. And if that's not the case, then you're not voting the right way. You need to make an informed decision, because that has serious, dangerous, and direct consequences on you, your neighbors, your family, your friends, and the city as a whole.
I I really like this idea of giving council members homework, so I'm going to keep trying to do it in my professional life. Thank you for going above and beyond. I think we're going to move based on the timing to audience Q&A soon, but I did want to ask Manny one more thing, and it's sort of harkening back, and I'm going to try to tie this to your experience a little bit. So going back to the question of, where do we build, if we agree that a lot more housing should be built in, wealthier communities, and that will require upzoning in those communities and maybe not touching so much or changing things so much in poorer communities of color. How do we deal with the fact that at the same time, many of those communities are saying, we want investment. We've been disinvested for many decades, and that's true. And maybe that's more on the public side. But how do we balance that of like, we don't want building a lot of housing in wealthy white communities to mean that poor communities of color are neglected. So how do we balance those two things? And to tie this a little bit to what you're doing, being from Santa Ana and now seeing this in Oakland, I think you can have kind of different perspectives on that. I'm curious if you've kind of gleaned anything from those experiences, and if they differ, between Santa Ana and Oakland, or if they're maybe surprisingly similar.
Yeah, no, there's definitely kind of an ongoing California phenomenon, right? So this entire housing crisis is up and down the state at every region. You can go into disinvested areas of the Central Valley that haven't seen any investment for decades, and have housing that is totally substandard. That really reminds me of what Santa Ana had in the 1980s, where you still had a lot of kind of multifamily apartment complexes that just had no money put into them. So for me, I think the priority with community members ends up becoming reinvestment into existing housing so that it's dignified housing, right? So that the top priority for a community like mine might not necessarily be like, oh, we need to construct way more additional apartment complexes, but it might be more along the lines of those that already exist should be refurbished. It's something probably along the lines of a relatively low interest loan in order to kind of make these buildings sustainable. What can you invest now that will make the building, that will extend the building's life, right? So the most sustainable building is one that's already built. The ability to go back and convert, seismically retrofit substandard buildings in our downtowns. I know that there's about 3 to 4 that are, if they were returned to their original single room occupancy style, right? Like, so we had SROs that provided affordable housing for a lot of folks in the downtown. They were deemed as sources of blight. Our ability to have SROs was removed. And then we end up with a lot of people on the street, and we're like, well, where did everyone come from? Well, you kicked them out of, what was formerly very affordable housing. So there are still opportunities for investment where you don't necessarily have to kind of add in so much as repurpose existing structures. And I think our Main Street corridor in Santa Ana is a perfect example of that, in which we have these office buildings that were essentially built when Santa Ana was the financial center of the county in the 1960s and 70s. Beautiful mid-century modern structures that do require a significant amount of investment when it comes to their infrastructure upgrades in order to be habitable by residents. So those sorts of programs are what I see, we would probably want, and focus in on the reinvestment aspect within Santa Ana and other communities that kind of have these built out cores that need to be repurposed, right? There is still a funding gap there. And I think Rochelle could probably talk to you about like a little bit more about the details as how like those funding gaps, what the degree of those funding gaps are. I just know that we have a lot of office space that goes unused that could provide housing that would be modeled ideally for me along a single room occupancy style so that it provides the most amount of affordability by design, right? The building's there. You make it so that it has the basic needs. I am living in my all-purpose kitchen. The bathroom's there, which is great. So this kitchen, there's my bed, there's my living room, but it serves my needs, right? So I just like moved over to Oakland. Love it. Great access to everything around me. I didn't really need a large space, and I'd rather save money than get an extra room that I'm not going to use because we're all on lockdown anyways. So I'm just going to be here in this one room. So that's just to say that there are different ways to build and to add units without necessarily saying like, okay, we're going to construct a bunch of new stuff. We're going to tear buildings down. It's like, how do you make use of what's already there? I will say though that the one thing about kind of to tie it into other communities and investments into additional housing in more affluent cities, I think that that is usually something that we need to do with coordination with our transportation agencies, right? So OCTA needs to very systematically go through and say like, okay, what are the potential high quality transit corridors in these more affluent communities, right? Because right now it's like, oh, well, we don't have a bus that comes in every 15 minutes, even though they have, I would say, highways as streets, right? Like these highway streets that are, 16 lanes wide. I've seen major international highways that are smaller than some of these roads in South County. And if you can make like room for like one BRT line, so one bus rapid transit line that services particular corridor that again is identified through a public process, and then we say this is where the growth corridors are in Southern Orange County, that would be my dream, right? But I don't know that we're talking about this again. If we have the ear of the Orange County Board of Supervisors, of the folks over at OCTA, and those are the types of investments that I would like to see that would lead to more equitable distribution of housing moving forward. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. But I hope that answers some of the question, maybe.
Yeah. What you just made me think of too is I have a friend who lives sort of in his parents' like second home, of course, not a home that he could afford himself, at sort of the border between Fountain Valley and Huntington Beach. And I've driven there a bunch of times, and it's these, that whole area is this very, rectilinear grid thing, these like super blocks that would be, if you just like replaced all of that with 4-story apartments, like 5 square miles of it, it would be an amazing community for one thing, and like extremely transit friendly if you just put some bus rapid transit on those lines. Very much like Barcelona style, with like you have the main roads, but the inner ones are kind of not for circulation. So I can say that because I'm not from Orange County and no one can get mad at me. But maybe you can't. But I think
I'll say it again.
You could say it too, yeah.
Because it's Fountain Valley, like I think, like I said to folks, like if people are angry at me, they can like track me down and then yell at me in person, and then we'll just have a drink and we'll be okay. Like that's a benefit of working local. Is like if you really want to talk to folks, you can. But yeah, the what is it? The soft yoke, hard shell model, like in Tokyo too, right? It's like same thing, and that's something that we need to learn from some of these international examples.
Mm-hmm.
Because Orange County should be like an international leader, right? Like we're bigger than most states. We have a higher GDP than most countries, and yet we still think in this kind of very small area because our local politics are so fragmented, right? There's not like a bigger Orange County identity because LA, like we're all part of LA apparently, like rather than being around
anywhere else you'd be the dominant force, but here you're kind of subordinate in that respect, just in terms of population and everything.
Manny brought up something that I'd love to say. I think what people hear when they hear density is they hear 1970s affordable housing projects, those giant social experiments that no one in their right mind would say is a good idea. But the very people who don't like the idea of that will wax nostalgic about, oh, when I was in Barcelona, and it is a city built on density. I think they assume that we are not intelligent enough to build in, or they can hold us accountable to build in the pedestrian component of it. The reason why those communities are successful is because they've got the restaurants downstairs. They've got the services, the dry cleaners, all of the things that you need are on the ground level, and they still have created communities. What I think is so interesting about a city like Irvine, for example, or some of the South County cities, these are all walled in communities. And when I have driven through, I can't say I've seen people, going door to door with their cup of sugar to share with their neighbors. So these utopian ideals that they are peddling don't necessarily translate into real life. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but there is no reason why when we envision a community with more density that we have to consider it one size fits all. I also agree when I drive through the neighborhoods in some of these cities, yes, it's a 6-lane highway. You don't have to have a light rail. You could have going down the center of it a really neighborhood focused trolley car. You know, we really could create, if what they're afraid of is losing that sense of community, then let's figure out how to build this and maintain that sense of community. We don't have to put a light rail system, an underground subway. We can take that center, those center 2 lanes and put a car. It amazes me when people go to something like Americana Plaza or the Grove in LA, and they will stand in line to jump on that little train, that little trolley that goes, what is it, 500 feet? But they're just excited to get on that thing to go from, and I think if they're that excited of the nostalgia, imagine what that would look like going down Main Street in Irvine. That people can still have that sense of Orange County-ness, and they still have that ability. I sometimes wonder when we talk about, we're preparing more density along the transit lines, and I wonder when I see that Orange County is removing transit, are these communities smart enough to know that that's coming, and therefore they're getting rid of the excuse? They're creating their excuse. So, gosh, wish we could do it. We just don't have transit. Well, then if people aren't using it, create a different kind of transit system that can move people along. I just think we need to get rid of the excuses. Somebody put in the chat, what if there was a tax on people for cities for not doing it? And my fear is that people would, they would gladly write the check. What I think is have a financial penalty, but you still have to do it. The thing is, the penalty gets greater the longer it takes you to do it. Therefore, it behooves you to make the change quicker. And it doesn't have to be all low income, extremely low income. We believe in a mixed income model. That way you can take care of your elders, your young people, your families. There is a pathway into home ownership. Perhaps we have some of these where they end up, from leasing, they turn into ownership. So that is a pathway into home ownership. There's just so much flexibility. And I think what we are doing is making arguments about outdated prototypes. I don't want that in my neighborhood. I don't want that high rise. Well, nobody wants the 1970s high rise, but we're talking about something new. And so I think we have to get, there really has to be a consequence that forces people to figure out, well, if I've got to do it, let me find a better way to do it.
Mm-hmm. And so I want to go into some audience Q&A here, and we're sort of getting at one question I want to ask already, which is Rona Henry saying, hoping to hear more strategies to align to a third way versus just defining the problem. And I think, defining the problem is obviously important, but we do want to talk about what we actually do about all of this. And so I'm going to kind of leave it open to everyone to take this one of two ways. One, just being like policy strategies, whether it's on the building, housing, protecting tenants, whatever subsidies, whatever direction you want to go with that. Or, I don't know the political context really in Orange County like I do in LA, and what the political obstacles are. They're probably somewhat different than they are up here. But if anyone wants to talk about that side of things, like what is politically stopping, maybe more so at like the community level, at the advocate level, and not just putting it all on elected officials, but like what on the coalition building side could be done to make these changes as well. So I'll open that up for anyone.
I can jump first because I think I'll have the least to say. But one of the things I was trying to think about, because I saw that question in the Q&A, is that identifying the solutions is just as important, or identifying the problem is just as important as figuring out what the solutions are. Because I think we all kind of touched upon that. And I think Manny said it earlier, is, when we're not having these conversations, I think I said it too, we're not having these conversations, these cycles aren't coming up within a term of a council member or within the turnover of someone, not getting reelected. It's hard to have this at the top of our focus. I think the other thing too that I can say as a millennial elected is that we need a different kind of elected, and we need more of them, because oftentimes I'm the youngest person in the meeting. Oftentimes I'm the only person of color, which makes my job more difficult. Whether I'm on a, I sit on like 20 different committees and boards. I'm a directly governor appointed state commissioner. I'm on 4 or 5 different committees for SCAG. I'm on 5 for a League of Cities. And time again, I'm the only one advocating for the things that we're talking about. And so why is that? Because council members tend to be people who are affluent, conservative, white, and retired, or are their own bosses, so have this time to spare to dedicate to this, but then their priorities are, making buddies with developers and bringing that in. And the fear is, if we have all these contingencies or these rules, that we're not going to have the developers come and invest their money into our cities. And so we're focused and fragmented in how do we get money for our city, which is really important. I think Rochelle touched upon this before, where it's competing with our tax and then our ability to then invest. And so it's really important for us to have those revenue streams, because property taxes and sales tax just aren't enough anymore, especially when you're in the middle of a pandemic, right? You're seeing the money that didn't come in, and that's furloughs, that's layoffs, it's programs that didn't get done, events that aren't being had, other fun things or other important resources that we wanted to give that we can no longer do. Again, it's not my problem. At the city level, I can't dictate this. This is the state. And then you have state legislators who, with all good intentions for the most part, don't have the local level experience, because they didn't run for city council or school board. They just went straight into running for assembly or Senate or Congress. And so they don't come with that foundational knowledge, and they're thinking, this is how I'm going to solve the problem, without knowing the unintended consequences for the local level. And while I admire the gung-ho attitude to do that, it takes you having conversations with these local electeds to figure out, like, why doesn't this bill work for them? Having that cookie cutter general, like, let's set a standard at the very least, is great, but then it poses different challenges for different areas, whether you're, rural cities, cities like Garden Grove, where we're the 5th largest in Orange County, but for whatever reason think we're like some bedroom type small city. It poses those different challenges. And so the solution really is changing the wave of leadership that we have, and having folks that have this lived experience, that understand what it is to worry about their next meal, to have someone in their family like myself who had been homeless living out of their truck, whatever the case may be, to be worried about how you're going to make your next rent while paying for your insurance and your student loan and your car payment and just, is McDonald's dollar menu your option? And I say this because, again, to my point, electeds have predominantly been affluent, conservative, white men, mostly men, not even women. And so when I ran, I was 24, as I stated, and I had to loan myself $2,000 just to get started, because no one believed in me. Nobody wanted me. I came out of nowhere and had zero experience. And I was eating off the dollar menu. I would skip meals. Sometimes I wouldn't eat. And, my campaign manager, who was supposed to be the person I pay, would literally bring me food to make sure that I just made it through to election. And that shouldn't be the case. But I believe so strongly that the voice that I represent, that I amplify, was so desperately needed and not there, that I was like, I have nothing to lose. Like, might as well just try. And if I don't win, then I don't win. Running for office shouldn't be to secure your next seat or to get reelected. It should be for the good that you're set to do in the time frame that you are given. But we're so worried about being reelected or running for another position that we don't actually take these bold stances and say these crazy things that I'm mostly known for. And so it makes it very difficult. And so that was a long-winded, hoping to provide some sort
I'm
of—
hearing an endorsement for publicly funded campaigns in there, maybe. And to add on to my question a little bit, or like the reason for asking it the way I did, I think it's my opinion that we mostly know what we need to do if we really want to make housing more affordable, to help people stay in their homes. It's really not a technical question of we have to figure out what to do. We have to figure out how to do it politically. It's a political problem. And that's why I've been asking this question about coalitions and how we bring the right people in. Not to say that the specifics, the technical stuff doesn't matter, because it's really important. That's what my book is about. But you can have the best ideas in the world, and if you don't have the people behind them to turn them into actual policy, then it's not going to do you any good.
Just 2 seconds. Sorry for everyone who else wanted to speak. It's just really important to your point. It's that, am I brave enough to do the right thing, right? But when you are like, I've had death threats. I've had police chiefs' moms tell me that I need to be dragged out by my feet from the dais. I've had my council colleagues' moms harass me and say horrible things on Facebook. I've had people make up FPPC complaints. I've had people move someone from a different city within 12 hours of the filing deadline to run against me, all in an effort to get rid of me. So the political like fear is real. It's just whether or not that is more important to you than doing the good.
Manny or Rochelle, you want to add anything?
Again, Rochelle, the ability to count to a majority is probably one of the key things I learned, right? So in my city, it was always count to 4. If you could count to 4, majority of the board, that was kind of your ticket, right? So like one of the reasons I can honestly say that I felt comfortable moving to the Bay Area was I was actually much more hopeful with the new council majority that came into Santa Ana. So it's not like it's all doom and gloom. I'm very supportive of our new mayor, Ty Fan, Jonathan Ryan Hernandez, and Jesse Lopez. I think that they are essentially the most kind of pro-housing group, but kind of in this balance, like how do we make sure that housing is a priority? Group that I've ever seen.
Also, shout out to Ty, who was in my USC class for grad school. Yeah, that's right. Showing all of us up for sure.
There we go. Yeah, so Ty's cool. But like there is kind of this emerging political coalition that is possible and is there. So I think one of the questions that we had was about the mechanics as to how you actually get that done. So the way that I'm hoping that this kind of moves forward in my own city and kind of in communication with a lot of the council members there is that there's a housing ad hoc that was put together specifically to address the issue of housing and what the city's kind of overall strategy would be. So when I talk about a kind of a grand bargain, it's like I'm hoping that those conversations occur kind of within that ad hoc committee. And what it essentially takes is your city's political leader. In our case, it's our mayor, right? Kind of forming that center block, kind of having that overarching view. Someone from our more progressive kind of like liberal wing of the Democratic Party in our Santa Ana context, and then someone who's a potential swing vote. So so Ty. So that's basically Jesse Lopez, Ty, and Mayor Sarmiento are all kind of working on this housing issue together. And I'm hoping that out of that emerges what can be the majority's kind of grand bargain, right? So that's where, a lot of the technical issues that we're talking about that we can kind of solve for will have that political will. So, and for the people kind of asking, it's like, how do you count to that majority of those 3 people that can kind of get in a room, try to work out a deal and figure out the path forward for your particular city? And I think that that's going to be different for each city. And I don't always advocate for local control, because I think sometimes local control really means like control from like one person in one neighborhood, like for the entire city. But there is that role for people to kind of come together to try to create these paths that are only going to be possible if the political will is there to support that outcome. So every 2 years, try to support the person you think is most in line with at least having the conversation. They don't have to agree with everything, but who's the person that's willing to have the conversation. And then once you get to the point of actually having that majority, then you have to get them to work and you have to show up and support. Because one of the things that we see is, when there's a lack of affordable housing in a project, affordable housing advocates come out and say, like, we don't support this housing. You must not build it. It's going to displace folks. And I understand the fears of, displacement through investment in high end. All new housing for the most part, when it's market rate, will be higher end just by the sheer cost of construction. But there is no support when an all affordable housing project comes up and the city is like, yeah, let's build this. Like no one shows up to say, yay, let's go ahead and build this. So there's still kind of like that missing from our local ecosystem, which is different than kind of what I'm seeing up here, in which you have consistent applied political pressure in support.
And just maybe as like a motivation for the people in the audience, when I look at places like what's happening in Berkeley right now, I think is really instructive, where Berkeley was known as a very anti-housing place for a long time. And yet, things just shifted with basically, it seems like the election of Councilmember Terry Taplin onto the city council. And it's not just him. Like there's, I don't know how to pronounce Drosti. She was on already, and she's been a great partner on this. Robinson also has been a great partner. But before they represented a majority, they just weren't able to move these things forward. And now once they got that majority, all the work that people have been doing kind of in the darkness, it probably felt like for years, moving things forward and building up the coalition. Now, once you actually have the representation in place, you're ready to hit the ground running. And so all of which is just to say that like the work you're doing, even when it feels like nothing's changing, can really make a difference. Rochelle, did you have something?
Yeah, I'm looking at the questions and people are asking.
And I guess, I'm sorry, Elizabeth, are we stopping at 11:30? I might just have to ask Rochelle to be quick.
We are, this is awesome. So I'm happy to be here as long as you
I can go a little longer.
to carry on the conversation. Yeah.
Okay, I just didn't want to worry people too much.
First, people are asking for solutions rather than identifying the problems. And I want to say that this is one of the solutions, and to thank Elizabeth for putting something like this together. I have always felt that we are not doing a good enough job as housers showing the good that we are doing. Sometimes we can get caught in our day-to-day work, and we're moving the mission and we're doing our duty and whatnot, but we're talking to each other and not to the public. And our electeds are looking for successes, and they need to hear it from their constituents, from their voter base. And if we're not sharing with the voter base the success that we're having, then we're doing ourselves a disservice. Mark Asturias scolded me for talking about not passing, not having those accidental chats in the front yards of in Irvine, and that was hyperbolic, and that was beneath me. But I think it is important for us to understand that adding affordable housing doesn't mean you still can't hang out with your neighbors. I think what we have is an either or, an all or nothing. And I have found that with housing, all the money, as I said, all the money goes into seniors and nobody else. All the money now goes into veterans and no more to the seniors. It all goes here. Everybody is trying to find a way to do, to have those wonderful, engaging communities. And for a lot of people, that means single family neighborhoods, or neighborhoods with 6 lanes of walking and, beautiful walled-in communities, but they don't have the ability to understand that neighborhoods can look as different as our neighbors. And so when people talk to us about, well, the property value is going down, there's great studies that show you not only does the property value not go down, in very high communities, it's a net zero, meaning there is no impact. In lower income communities, the neighborhood improves, the economy improves. Now, some people can say, well, that's going to usher in gentrification, but this is what I'm talking about. If we are doing the homework and the planning and rolling up our sleeves, we can curb that. We can control how that happens, so that we are encouraging people to move in, but we are also encouraging people to return and stay in the communities. Those are the conversations we need to have. And if we can share with our electeds and our community members and those block clubs that are terrified to have us come in, if we can show them that this can be a wonderful symbiotic partnership where we're all locked arms and we can, skip down our newly revitalized communities, I think we can make that. But I think that we have been so caught up in each of our own little teams and not coming together. So again, I have to thank Elizabeth and YIMBY groups and Kim and others who are in their respective areas for bringing us all together to find out that we've got much more in common than we do not in common. We're all looking for vibrant communities where everyone can thrive. And so long as we can figure out how to do that together, I think that's the key.
And I think that is as good a place to end as any. So I will thank our panelists very, very much for this great conversation, and I'll pass it back to Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for a great conversation. One thing that I do just want to add, and I think just potentially for our audience of YIMBY watchers is, the unique role that I think YIMBY has to play is that we will continue to push in high opportunity, predominantly white communities to make room. And that is so important because I see it as a sort of an unholy alliance that, older white homeowners in some communities have managed to convince low-income communities of color that, everything has to stay exactly the same or they're going to be displaced. And I think Rochelle is right. We have tools, we can pass laws, we can do our homework before we get to the point of gentrification and displacement to create more housing opportunities so that we don't have communities where all the need is in one place and where we are no longer maintaining those walled off, single family communities. I mean, I live in Fullerton, I live in a single family community, but it's not walled off. It's part of the original, rectilinear grid street plan. And I know some of the people that live down the street from me more than I know my own neighbor because I knew what flag they were flying during election season or whose sign was out in their neighborhood. And I chose my friends even within walking distance of my house based on people who, saw the world the way that I saw it, which was that I was sitting in an incredible place of privilege. And it was my job to make sure that my community wasn't only for people who looked like me and that my daughter went to school with people who did not look like her, and that there was an opportunity to access, the less than a mile from the train into LA, right, at the Metrolink station, and all the other resources that come from living in a high opportunity community. So if you find yourself in that position and you want to join this fight, I would encourage you to join us, join the YIMBY movement. We are at peopleforhousing.org, and the larger YIMBY movement, the people that do the local organizing is YIMBY Action at yimbyaction.org. And I'm really grateful for Shane and Kim and Manny and Rochelle for being my partners in this fight. I am with you, and I hope that we can continue to have these conversations and push for change. And I would just like to point out that I think everybody here is younger than me. So that gives me hope right there, because this is the future. I am looking forward at 45 years old. I'm looking forward to the people that are leading us into the future that I want for my child and for all of yours. So with that, I'll leave it there and say thank you. And I really appreciate your time. And I hope that this was informative, and we will put it up on YouTube. So stay tuned. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.